This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. A cattle market update with Oklahoma State University livestock economist Derrell Peel starts today's show as he reinforces the fundamentals and how they are looking in our current market. Keeping the show rolling is the Beef Cattle Institute's Brad White and Bob Larson as they discuss research that looked into record keeping for cattle herds on a recent Bovine Science episode. Drew Ricketts, K-State wildlife specialist, concludes the show as he explains distemper in raccoons and where it is likely most prevalent. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Monday show with a cattle market update from Oklahoma State University livestock economist Derrell Peel. Derrell, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, you bet. Great to be here.
Derrell, how are the cattle markets looking right now?
Well, obviously, we've had some turbulence in the last couple of weeks, which I'm sure we'll visit about here. But, cattle markets are they're still the same as they were a couple of weeks ago in terms of the fundamentals. We talk about strong demand. Box beef is still looking good. Cattle numbers haven't changed in the last 2 weeks. So, we got to deal with these things as they come. But the markets are, underneath it all, just the same as they have been.
So feeder cattle, fed cattle, all those prices looking good for a cattle producer right now?
Well, obviously, we've taken some pretty big hits with the external influences. It starts in the futures market. That's really where it should happen. Futures market's job basically is to anticipate the worst when stuff jumps up as a surprise. And then usually the worst doesn't happen, so we back away from that. We have had a whole series of things that have shocked the market in the last 2 weeks or so. The market's taken a pretty big hit. And with that size of a hit in the futures market, it's inevitably going to filter down into some impacts on cash markets. So, we've certainly seen some short run impacts here. And, again, we're in a political realm with a lot of this external stuff. So, more than likely it will pass. It will, we'll sort it out and it'll settle down. And again, the market fundamentals underneath that haven't really changed. So I expect this market to bounce back reasonably soon as things settle down just a little bit.
What are those market fundamentals that you think are key and that cattle producers should keep in mind?
Yeah, and I do think that's important when we see these kind of shocks. Again, cattle numbers haven't changed. We don't have any data yet to really confirm that we are saving heifers. We got here, over, a drought force liquidation that pulled us down smaller than we intended to be. We don't have a pipeline of heifers right now. So there's no fast way to rebuild the herd. Producers up to this point haven't shown a lot of inclination to respond to market signals in terms of high calf prices in particular. I think they will eventually, but the longer that we draw that out, the longer we're going to be in a very tight supply situation. And if we start now, we start with heifer calves, it's going to be 2 to 3 years before we would really change things very much from that standpoint. So producers, I think, even though we're dealing with a lot of short-term issues here, I think producers really need to keep their eye on the long game here and not deviate from what their plans are, what their overall strategy is for the next few months and even years going forward.
Do you think sometimes, not looking at our cattle producers, but people outside of the industry forget that you can't just make a change in the cattle industry within a few months?
Oh, yeah, I think that's become very apparent. In fact, it's been kind of apparent for me, at least, in terms of, media calls that I get and so on. Really started about 3-4 months ago. I started, sort of the general consuming public and the media, broadly speaking, began to realize that beef prices were high, and I started getting calls. And so I spend a lot of time explaining the slow biological nature of cattle production and that it took several years to get here, and it's going to take several years to remedy this situation, and that there's really nothing we can do to change that timeline, or certainly not to speed it up at any rate, beyond what the biology and Mother Nature dictates here.
What have been some of those external factors then that have been messing with the cattle market?
First of all, I guess the initial shock was an announcement that we were going to try to import more beef from Argentina to help them out, but also then to help lower high beef prices in the U.S. The reality is that we import about 2% of our beef from Argentina. Even if they doubled it, which is about what the new tariff rate quota that was announced would allow from current levels, it wouldn't really make any difference as far as beef supplies in the U.S. So, the industry reacted very negatively. I think as much as anything to the precedent, the idea that we're going to deliberately use that kind of external meddling in the market, if you will, rather, the market's already responding to the supply situation in the U.S. We've increased imports 30% year over year so far this year. So it wasn't like it wasn't happening, but this one was very arbitrary, very sudden, and that caused the initial shocks. And then it's led to a series of things after that. USDA has announced a wide variety of things to, quote, try to help jumpstart herd rebuilding. Those, depending on how the details work out, may not hurt anything, but they certainly won't change the timeline again for what's going to happen here going forward. And then there continues to be additional political statements relative to some of the trade issues we've had with Brazil, with China, with others. I'm not sure anybody really knows what the situation is right now, but the bottom line is none of that really changes the situation dramatically in the U.S. market.
You mentioned we've increased imports by 30%, and where then are we getting that beef from?
The data we have is through July. Of course, we haven't gotten the more recent trade data. For the first 7 months of the year, Brazil was the biggest source of imports. They've really increased dramatically. Brazil exports about 10 times, more than 10 times as much beef to the U.S. as Argentina does. It's similar kind of beef. We use it the same way. It goes into our ground beef market largely. It's processing lean beef for the most part. Australia is number 2. We get beef from New Zealand, Canada, Mexico, that sort of rounds out the top few sources. Argentina last year and for the first 7 months of this year was the 9th largest source, again, only accounting for about 2% of our beef imports.
Derrell, as we've seen our U.S. cattle herd be a bit smaller in size, but we're still importing from a place like Brazil, does that mean their cattle herd is booming?
Brazil, their herd is actually been getting just a little bit smaller, not like the U.S. or anything like that. So, and of course, the U.S. is by a smidge the largest beef producing country in the world, but Brazil is right behind at this point. Of course, our production is down a little bit. So, Brazil is a big market, and they are the biggest by quite a bit, the biggest exporter of beef in the world.
So, Derrell, we've established that it would take 2 to 3 years to potentially see a turnaround in the cattle herd in the U.S., but is it going to be in 2 to 3 years, or is it really further out?
I don't think we know that yet. When we look at the cattle cycle, we've had the liquidation. January 1, 2025 might have been the cyclical low in inventories, but we don't know that yet. We won't know that till we get the 2026 numbers. It could be fractionally higher as far as the beef cow herd goes. If it is, it'll just be barely higher, but it might be high enough that we can say 2025 was the low. But we already know from the pipeline of replacement heifers that we already see, we don't have enough heifers to grow in 2026. And it doesn't look like we're saving enough heifers now to grow very much in 2027. So we keep sort of pushing it off in terms of that path of rebuilding. Cow slaughter has decreased enough to kind of stabilize the herd at the current low level. And that would be the reason why 2025 might prove to be technically the cyclical low. But it's really establishing a stabilization at this low level. It's not, you can't grow off of reducing cow slaughter. You have to reduce cow slaughter and increase heifer retention simultaneously to rebuild the herd. And we're not doing the heifer part of it at this point.
Derrell, if you had the opportunity to talk with some customers or consumers of beef that aren't in the cattle industry, what would you share with them?
Well, there's a couple of things that are important here. Beef prices are record high pretty much across the board. Consumers have been willing to pay that. And, the market is working. Beef production is falling because of where we are with cattle inventories. So there is less beef. The market's going to ration that to the folks that want it the most and have the means to pay the most. And all of that's working. So, it's not clear to me that we need to if you will, mess with the market a little bit. Some of it comes down to the last, CPI report on inflation. Beef was kind of identified as one of the markets that's up the most, and there's other markets as well. But the thing is, no one market causes inflation. Inflation is a general concept that where a lot of markets are going up, and beef happens to be going up coincidentally, not for any broad-based reason that's affecting other markets as well. So even if we had no inflation, beef prices would still be high because of the supply fundamentals that we have and the demand fundamentals. And so, it's kind of being rolled into a lot of other issues here, I think, and that's unfortunate because then, gets kind of confusing and causes some additional issues.
Do you think the beef and cattle market is going to almost get itself out of the news here soon?
Well, you certainly would like to, I think. It's going to depend on, again, this attention that's been focused on it, kind of from an inflation perspective, may not let it, because beef prices aren't going to come down, and there's really nothing anybody can do to change that. We're already importing a lot of beef. There's no additional imports that fundamentally are going to change that very much. And again, that's mostly affecting the ground beef market for the most part. So there's certainly nothing that's going to change steak prices, for example. And so, hopefully things settle down and we get some of the headlines out of the beef market, and the beef markets will take care of themselves if that happens.
Derrell, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Yeah, you bet. Happy to do it.
That was Oklahoma State University livestock economist Derrell Peel. If you would like to read more on these topics, I will link some Cow-Calf Corner newsletters that Derrell has wrote in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be right back. You're tuned back into Agriculture Today, and we continue our show with part of a Beef Cattle Institute Bovine Science podcast with Bob Larson and Brad White as they discuss keeping records and what is important to producers and feed yard owners. They also discuss tips for finding what system is best for you.
It's a question that's interested me for a long time as well, is what is the appropriate amount of records and what type of records should we keep? And, to be fully honest, when I was in veterinary practice, I had dairy clients, I had swine clients, and I had beef clients. And the record-keeping systems that each of those types of operations used was quite different. And one of the questions is that appropriate that they're different? And what should cow-calf producers learn from some of those other livestock enterprises as far as the types of records that they keep?
Yeah, and you pulled together 3 different papers. I'm just going to highlight those because we're going to talk through them in aggregate today as we go through. The first was a paper from 2023 with Heffley as the lead author and Kopp as the last author, called Information Management and Beef Cow-Calf Operation Data Priorities, Recording and Sharing, and it was in Applied Animal Science. The next 2 are both from Isaac Jumper with Dave Smith as the final author, and they were published, both of them in Bovine Practitioner, both of them in 2022, and they were surveys to look at cow-calf producer access to technology and what records they use. So these 3 papers kind of the basis for our discussion.
Yeah, exactly.
What led you to these 3 papers?
Well, the first paper is actually one that I helped write, and it was a group that we did between the vet school and Ag Econ, looking at what kind of records, and we were particularly interested in what kind of records do cow-calf producers want to collect and are willing to share to feedlot producers, and what records do feedlot producers want to get from cow-calf producers, and what are they willing to share back?
Okay, so one reason to keep records is part of my marketing plan, part of my transition of those calves and information, and that's the focus of that paper. The Jumper papers really more look at why would I keep records for production managements within my herd, not necessarily sharing them.
That's exactly right.
So let's start with the information sharing. Mm-hmm. What did you find out in that?
Well, really, the cow-calf producers and feedlot producers were willing to share information, at least according to this survey. There was a little bit of a disconnect on exactly what they wanted. For instance, one interesting thing was, for the cow-calf producers, and again, I think a lot of times they're coming at it what's most valuable to them. And things like birth dates, weaning weights, those types of things were very valuable to the cow-calf producers, and they were willing to share those with feedlot producers. They were also willing to share, what vaccination protocols had been done with the cattle at what time. And that was actually something that feedlot producers wanted. Feedlot producers were also interested in things about, the implant use of the cow-calf producers, kind of health of the herd, those types of things. And according to the survey, there was still interest in sharing those, but not as high a level as some of the, demographic things like when does the calving season start, how many cows were in the group, those types of things. So there was pretty good alignment between what cow-calf producers were willing to share and what feedlot producers want, but it wasn't perfect alignment.
What were the most important factors that the feed yards wanted?
Well, they really wanted as much information about the calves themselves that might impact how they then would process those calves. So what vaccinations that group of cats had in the past, when they were weaned, how is that in relationship to when they arrived, and some group demographics as far as, weight range and those types of things. So pretty much kind of just a little bit enhanced of what they would get from the type of information they would get through an auction market.
Okay, let's shift to the first jumper paper, which talks about kind of the producer methods and opinions. What do they do and how do they do it? What did he find?
Well, a couple of things that I want to put as some guardrails around these papers. They were both based on surveys of National Cattlemen's Beef Association members. So a little bit of a biased sampling. The herd sizes tend to be a little bit larger than the national average. But of that, what they found was basically a high percentage of herds, upwards of almost 90%, were recording individual cow and calf ID numbers. And the reason I kind of led with to consider that is I would be surprised if that was truly the national average for herds of all types. They were also collecting some of the things that we talked about from the earlier paper, the date the breeding season starts, the date the calving season starts, how long the calving season was, weaning dates, average weaning weights, and those types of things. So again, some of those group descriptions or herd descriptions were actually pretty commonly collected. Less commonly collected were some individual, not weights, but things like body condition scores, reproductive tract scores, foot health, those types of things, which is not surprising. Those are kind of newer numbers to be collecting and weren't as commonly collected.
In the jumper paper, almost 60% of people cited the challenges with understanding some of the commercial software that was available as one of the reasons they didn't keep computerized records. And you and I have both gone through this, and on the cow-calf record-keeping systems, and we've been on the flip side where we've helped put some things together. Right. It is easy to let that snowball gather a lot of steam before it gets to the end of the hill, and all of a sudden I'm collecting 15, 20, 30 pieces of information versus the 2 or 3. How far do I need to go?
That is a good discussion point of, again, one of the impediments is the complexity of the data collection systems. And a lot of times, now, in the jumper paper, they also pointed out that one of the herd types that are most likely to have computerized record-keeping systems were purebred producers. So then when you try to apply that to a commercial operation that honestly is managing cattle in groups and in relatively few large groups, that level of detail of information gathering doesn't really reward you with decision making because you're not making individual animal breeding decisions. You're not making individual animal keep cull decisions beyond whether they're pregnant or not. Those types of decisions, when they're made, if she's pregnant, I keep her. If I have this cohort, they're an age group and I'm going to feed them this way, I don't need so much granularity, so much individual information. So that's one of the problems is sometimes the computerized systems actually collect more data than people are actually going to use to make decisions. And they feel that mismatch.
And then it leads to, I want to quit. However, I tend to just quit everything rather than just
try to
prioritize and say, okay, I'm going to scale this back to the 2 or 3 pieces of information that I need. And I've seen that in others as well. And how do we make that balance? How do I decide what's important or not to really optimize my record keeping time?
So, and I'll just speak from my experience working with producers. I think one of the best ways is to ask, what information do you want? Most importantly, and make them pick one, and it might be weaning weights. And then once we collect that information, you can ask, well, I would be interested in what are the weaning weights by cow groups, such as my 2 and 3 year olds, my running age cows, my older cows. Is there a difference there? And the producer oftentimes, says, I would like to know that too. It's like, okay, then we need to know something about cow age. And then you might ask some questions of, if you have multiple breeding pastures, well, what is breed up percentage? What is the weaning weight from different breeding pastures? Okay, so then I need to keep breeding pastures. So again, the producer helps identify, well, what questions do I want to ask? And I try to focus on questions where I might make a management decision. I might do things differently if I knew this. And so the pieces of information that I really like, it is easier to collect this information if you have individual cow ID, even if I'm not really making individual cow decisions. I like it when one of the numbers in the ID is the year that cow was born. I really like some indication of when that calf was born or even when that cow was born. So it's just sequential from day of birth. So low numbers were born earlier, high numbers were born later. Those types of information, honestly, I can collect a lot of the information that I want on the ear tag of the animal themselves. And so a good ear tag numbering system can have a lot of information in it. And then things like either handwritten records or pretty simple spreadsheets, I can enter this year's numbers and then use the cow ID to start sorting them into different groups. I think there are opportunities to kind of hone in and identify exactly what data would be most valuable to me, depending on whether I'm a purebred producer or a commercial producer, whether I'm retaining ownership or selling at weaning. Do I have long-term relationships with my buyers or not? I think all of those would really change what kind of records I want to keep and what kind of records I might be willing to share. And so I think this is an area, record keeping, that can have an impact both on production. So, average weaning weight, calves weaned per cow exposed, as well as marketing, providing information to downstream buyers that have to be thought through, and they're going to be different for every producer.
Once again, that was part of the Beef Cattle Institute's Bovine Science podcast with Bob Larson and Brad White. If you'd like to hear the rest of this episode, you can do so by searching for Bovine Science on your favorite podcast platform, going to the Beef Cattle Institute's website, ksubci.org, or I will also link the rest of this episode in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but stick around because we have more for you up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we conclude our Monday show talking about raccoons with K-State wildlife specialist Drew Ricketts. Drew, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me back, Shelby.
Drew, what question and concerns have you been getting from a lot of people when it comes to raccoons?
This year, we are seeing lots and lots of sick raccoons in towns pretty much throughout Kansas. And what that tends to be most commonly in our state and really throughout the United States is canine distemper virus. And canine distemper virus, of course, is a disease that's caused by a virus. It can affect dogs. It affects many species of mammals that are wild. So this is a virus that manifests as kind of a nasty flu if we were to think about symptoms that we would see in humans. So really high fever, respiratory illness, discharge from the eyes that would look like really heavy sleep or mucus type discharge in the eyes. Also gastrointestinal distress that can make them not eat. And we end up seeing these sort of weak acting raccoons that might be skinny, maybe staggering around if they're able to get up. They also may just lay there and not flee like a normal raccoon would when we walked up to it. But one of the interesting things when we talk about disease is there's proximate causes of death and there's ultimate causes of death, right? So the proximate cause of death for a raccoon that gets distemper would be canine distemper virus, but most of them that die actually die from a pneumonia infection that they acquire as a result of the previous symptoms of that distemper.
Are people more likely to see these raccoons in towns and cities or in rural places?
We can see them in both areas. It's probably the distemper cases in more rural areas just aren't detected as often, but they're seen the most in areas where we have really high densities of raccoons. And we tend to see the highest densities of raccoons in suburban areas where we have lots of resources for raccoons, like food, and then we also have lots of habitat. And when we look at sort of the disease dynamics of this disease, there are some studies that suggest that we see kind of a 4-year cycle where we have maybe really low levels of infection most years, but then every 4 or 5 years, we have a big outbreak where we end up with lots and lots and lots of individuals that get sick and the resulting potential die-off in those years of high infection rates. And we're in one of those years right now. I've been getting calls about sick raccoons really since last spring. Another thing along with that is the within-year variation when we see lots of cases. And so during breeding season, when you have lots of interaction of raccoons because they're traveling around breeding with each other, we see high infections during that period. And so that's why we see sick raccoons in the spring. And then we might see sort of a lull during the summer. And then in the fall, when the young raccoons start to disperse, then we see another wave of infection and start seeing lots more sick raccoons during those years where the infection rate's high.
And are there some human safety concerns when it comes to these sick raccoons?
Absolutely. So, canine distemper virus is not known to infect humans, but anytime we see sick wildlife, we should not try and interact with that wildlife. Absolutely. It's normal to have compassion, but don't try and physically help a sick raccoon if you see it. Call the authorities like Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks. Anytime we try and interact with wildlife, we're exposing ourselves to potentially getting bitten, clawed, and those sorts of things. We might have to get post-exposure rabies treatment if we get bit by a raccoon that then gets away. We also run the risk of exposing our pets to disease too. So if you interact with a raccoon that's sick, has canine distemper virus, and then you come home, you run the risk of infecting your pet with that disease as well. So make sure that we also are vaccinating our dogs against canine distemper virus and these other diseases that are often reservoired in wildlife populations and then potentially can get to our pets through direct or indirect interactions with wildlife.
Drew, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
That was K-State Wildlife Specialist Drew Ricketts. That's all we have for you today on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you tomorrow.